The small-town diner had a warm, homey feel, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. It was the kind of restaurant where truckers stopped for a bite, families gathered after Sunday service, and the occasional group of bikers rolled in to grab a meal before hitting the road again. Tonight was no different. The hum of conversation mixed with the clatter of dishes, creating a peaceful, familiar atmosphere. But that peace was about to be shattered. A group of bikers stormed in, their heavy boots thudding against the tiled floor. Leather jackets, tattooed arms, and a sense of arrogance followed them like a shadow. They weren't just passing through, they wanted to be noticed. The biggest of them, a towering man with a thick beard and a mean scowl, scanned the room with a smirk, as if daring someone to challenge him. His buddies laughed loudly, shoving each other as they made their way to a booth in the corner. At first, no one paid them much attention. The locals knew better than to mess with guys like that. Even the waitress, who had served all kinds of customers over the years, kept her head down and went about her work. But then something, or rather, someone, caught their eye. Sitting alone at the counter was a boy, maybe 16 or 17, quietly eating his burger and fries. He wasn't scrawny, but he wasn't particularly built either. Just a regular kid, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. He kept to himself, focused on his food, but there was something about him that irritated the bikers. Maybe it was the way he didn't even glance in their direction, or the calm, unbothered way he carried himself. The leader of the group nudged his friend, nodding toward the boy. "Look at this guy," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Sitting there like he owns the place." His friends chuckled, their voices thick with amusement and something more, something cruel. The boy still didn't react. He dipped a fry into his ketchup and took a bite, completely unfazed. That only made them more annoyed. One of the bikers, a tall, lanky guy with a scar across his cheek, walked over and leaned against the counter next to him. "Hey kid," he said, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "You new around here?" The boy finally looked up, his eyes calm but unreadable. "Just passing through," he said simply, then went back to his food. The biker exchanged glances with his buddies. They were expecting nervousness, maybe even a little fear. Instead, they got indifference, and that didn't sit right with them. "What, too good to talk to us?" Another one piped up, stepping closer. "You think you're better than us, huh?" The boy sighed and set his burger down. He didn't look scared. He didn't even look annoyed, just patient, like he'd been through this before and knew exactly how it was going to play out. The leader of the group decided to push it further. He grabbed a fry off the boy's plate and popped it into his mouth. "Not bad," he said with a smirk. "What else you got?" The diner grew quieter. People pretended not to watch, but they were listening. The waitress hesitated behind the counter, unsure if she should step in. The boy finally turned to fully face the biker in front of him, and that's when something shifted. It wasn't anything obvious. He didn't puff out his chest or throw a punch. He didn't even raise his voice, but the air around him seemed to change. His eyes, steady, unblinking, held something that made the biker pause for just a second. "Are you done?" the boy asked, his voice calm but firm. That one sentence, so simple yet so full of something unshakable, made the leader hesitate, just for a moment, just long enough for the others to notice. And in that split second, the bikers realized they might have made a mistake, because this wasn't just any boy sitting at the counter. And they had no idea who they were messing with. The diner felt different now. The laughter and conversation from the other tables had faded into an uneasy silence, and even the sound of dishes clinking seemed to have stopped. The air was thick with something unspoken, something just beneath the surface. The bikers, who had walked in like they owned the place, were now staring at the boy with a mix of irritation and, though they wouldn't admit it, something else. The leader of the group, the one who had stolen the fry, narrowed his eyes at the boy. He didn't like the way this kid looked at him, so steady, so sure of himself. There was no panic, no stammering, no shrinking back like most people did when they tried to stand up to him. It was like this kid had seen worse. Like nothing about this situation surprised him. "What you just say?" the leader asked, his voice quieter now, more measured. The boy didn't flinch. He simply repeated, "Are you done?" The words weren't cocky. They weren't aggressive. But somehow, they carried more weight than if he had shouted. The other bikers shifted, sensing the subtle shift in control. One of them, the tall one with the scar, forced a laugh. "Hey, relax, kid. We're just having some fun," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had a moment ago. The boy picked up his burger again, like he had already dismissed them. That did something to the leader, made his blood run a little hotter. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by some kid barely out of high school. "All right," the leader muttered, forcing a grin. "I get it. You think you're tough." He took a step closer, close enough that the boy would have to react. But he didn't. Instead, the boy calmly reached for his drink, took a sip, and finally looked up again. "I just don't see the point," he said, his voice still level. "You came in here looking for attention. You got it. Now what?" The leader clenched his jaw. The other bikers were watching now, waiting to see what he'd do. A few of the diner's customers were sneaking glances too, pretending not to listen. Even the waitress had stopped pretending to wipe down the counter. The leader exhaled sharply, forcing another grin. "You talk real big for someone sitting down," he said. "Maybe you'd say they're a little different if you were standing." The boy didn't respond right away. He took another bite of his burger, chewed, swallowed. Then finally, he pushed his plate aside and placed both hands on the counter, fingers lightly tapping against the surface. Slowly, he stood up. Now, the bikers got a better look at him. He wasn't particularly tall, wasn't particularly bulky. But there was something in the way he moved, controlled, deliberate. Not tense, not rattled, just ready. The leader had been in plenty of fights before. He knew when someone was bluffing, when someone was all talk. But this was different. You could feel it now, something about the boy's presence that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Still, he wasn't about to back down. He had a reputation to keep. "What's your deal, huh?" the leader asked, his voice quieter now, as if he was starting to second-guess himself. "You military or something?" The boy tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Something like that," he said. That wasn't the answer the leader wanted. It wasn't even a real answer at all, but it said enough. One of the other bikers, the youngest of the group, shifted uncomfortably. "Hey man," he muttered to the leader, just loud enough for him to hear. "Maybe we should just drop it." The leader shot him a sharp look, but deep down he felt it too. The boy wasn't scared. He wasn't playing games. And now, for the first time, the leader was starting to wonder who exactly he was dealing with. Before he could say anything else, the door to the diner opened with a soft chime. A man stepped in, wearing a clean-cut suit, his eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. The boy's posture didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, recognition. The man in the suit spotted him immediately and walked over, completely ignoring the bikers. "You were supposed to wait outside," he said, his voice calm but firm. The boy shrugged, got hungry. The man sighed, then turned to the waitress. "His meal is covered," he said, placing a few crisp bills on the counter. Then he looked at the bikers, not with hostility, but with something even worse, complete disinterest. As if they weren't even worth acknowledging. The leader's pride burned at that. "Hey, who the hell are you?" he demanded, trying to regain some ground. The man in the suit didn't answer. Instead, he looked back at the boy. "It's time to go." The boy gave one last glance at the leader and his crew. There was no gloating in his expression, no smugness. Just quiet understanding, like he had already forgotten about them. Then he grabbed his hoodie from the back of his chair, slipped it on, and followed the man toward the door. As they stepped outside, the leader felt his breath finally release. He hadn't realized he'd been holding it. The whole diner was still watching, waiting to see if he'd say something, do something. But for the first time in a long time, he had no idea what to do. And as he watched the boy disappear into the night, a single thought kept gnawing at the back of his mind. Who the hell was that kid? The leader of the bikers sat back down, but he wasn't really there anymore. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his mind replaying the last few minutes over and over. His crew was quiet now, their usual rowdy energy replaced with something else: uncertainty. They had never backed down from anyone before, so why did it feel like they just had? The kid hadn't even threatened them. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown a punch. But the way he carried himself, the way he looked at them like he wasn't worried in the slightest, that was worse than any kind of bravado. And then there was the man in the suit, the way he had walked in like he owned the place, like he had been keeping an eye on the kid the whole time. The leader's jaw tightened. He hated the feeling that someone had just walked all over him and his crew without even trying. He needed answers. Outside, the boy and the man in the suit walked side by side down the dimly lit sidewalk. The town was quiet at this hour, with only the occasional car passing by. The boy stuffed his hands into his hoodie pocket, looking straight ahead. "You let them get too close," the man finally said. The boy smirked. They were harmless. The man sighed, clearly not amused. "You don't know that." The boy gave him a sideways glance. "I do, actually." The man stopped walking, forcing the boy to pause a few steps ahead. "You're not invincible," he said, his voice lower now, more serious. "You know what's at stake. You can't afford to take risks like that." The boy sighed, turning back to face him. "It wasn't a risk," he said simply. "They were just a bunch of guys trying to act tough. I've seen worse." The man studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" The boy didn't respond. He just waited. The man exhaled and glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. Then he lowered his voice even more. "They weren't the problem," he said, "but now they're curious, and that's a problem." The boy frowned slightly, but before he could say anything, the man started walking again. After a brief hesitation, he followed. Back at the diner, the leader of the bikers leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the table. His crew watched him, waiting to see what he'd say. Finally, he let out a low chuckle and shook his head. "That kid," he muttered, "he ain't normal." One of the bikers, the tall one with the scar, frowned. "You think he's dangerous?" The leader thought about that. "Not in the way you're thinking," he said. "But yeah, I think there's something off about him." The youngest biker, the one who had wanted to drop it earlier, hesitated before speaking. "You saw that guy in the suit," he said. "He wasn't just some random dude. He was watching the kid." The leader nodded. He had caught that too. The way the man had barely looked at them, like he wasn't worried about them at all, like they weren't even worth his time. That burned. The waitress walked by, pretending to refill their coffees even though their cups were still full. She had been at the diner for years. She had seen plenty of fights, plenty of tough guys rolling through town. But something about this night had unsettled her. "You boys should leave that one alone," she said quietly, not looking up from the coffee pot. The leader raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" She nodded, setting the pot down. "I don't know who he is, but I know trouble when I see it. And that boy, he's got trouble written all over him." The leader smirked, but there was no humor in it. He didn't like being told to walk away. He didn't like feeling outmatched. But still, something deep in his gut told him she was right. Outside, the boy and the man in the suit turned down a quieter street, away from the main road. The boy finally spoke again. "You think they'll come looking for me?" The man gave him a sharp look. "I know they will." The boy shrugged. "Then let them." The man stopped again, this time grabbing the boy's shoulder, forcing him to look at him. "You don't get to think like that," he said, his voice deadly serious. "You're not just some kid who can afford to make mistakes. You know who's after you. You know what they'll do if they find you." The boy clenched his jaw but didn't pull away. He knew the man was right. "They weren't the ones after me," he said after a moment. No, the man admitted, but they might lead the ones who are. The boy exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had been careful. He had kept his head down. He had stayed off the radar for this long. But one stupid moment, one meal at the wrong diner, and now there were people asking questions. And questions led to attention. And attention led to danger. Somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine roared to life. The boy turned his head slightly, listening. The man noticed too. "They're looking," the man murmured. The boy nodded. "Let's hope they don't find anything." But deep down, they both knew it was already too late for that. The night was quieter than it should have been. The small town had its usual sounds, the hum of streetlights, the occasional car rolling past. But there was something else lingering in the air, something heavier. The boy could feel it. So could the man walking beside him. They both knew the bikers wouldn't just let this go. That wasn't how people like them worked. And sure enough, as they turned the corner onto a side street, they heard it. The distant growl of motorcycle engines growing louder. The boy kept walking, hands still in his hoodie pocket, but his jaw tightened. The man noticed. "You should have listened to me back at the diner," he muttered under his breath. The boy didn't respond. There wasn't much to say. Behind them, the roar of the engines got closer. Then suddenly, they weren't just background noise anymore. They were here. Headlights swept over them as 3 bikes pulled up fast, screeching to a stop just a few feet away. The boy and the man turned, watching as the riders climbed off. It was the leader and 2 of his crew, the tall one with the scar and the younger one who had been hesitant back at the diner. The others were probably nearby, waiting, watching. The leader took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against the pavement. His face was different now. At the diner, he had been cocky, playing to his crew. Now, he wasn't playing anymore. "You got a second to talk?" he asked, his voice low, even. The man in the suit sighed. "This is a mistake," he said, shaking his head. The leader smirked. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I don't like not knowing things. And your little friend here?" He nodded toward the boy. "He doesn't add up." The boy finally spoke. "I told you, I'm just passing through." The leader gave a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, see, I don't buy that," he said. "Guys like me, we know people. We've seen all kinds. And you're not normal." The boy didn't react. The leader took another step closer. "You weren't scared back at the diner. And I don't mean tough guy not scared. I mean really not scared. Like you knew something we didn't." The younger biker shifted uneasily but said nothing. The tall one with the scar just watched, arms crossed. The leader continued, "And then there's him." He jerked his chin toward the man in the suit. "What kind of kid has a guy like that watching his back? A government guy, a bodyguard. Either way, it's got my interest." The boy met his gaze but stayed silent. The leader sighed and shook his head. "See, that's the thing. I don't like feeling like I got played. And that's what tonight feels like. Like we walked into something we don't understand." The man in the suit exhaled slowly. "Then maybe you should walk away." The leader let out another short laugh. "Yeah. And what happens if I don't?" The boy finally moved. Just a small shift, a slight adjustment in his stance. But it was enough. The leader noticed, so did the scarred biker. They weren't dealing with some random kid. They knew that now. But what they didn't know, what was eating at them, was what exactly they were dealing with. The air between them grew heavier. The street, once just another empty road in a quiet town, now felt smaller, closed in. The boy took a step forward now, closing some of the space between them. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice calm. The leader's smirk faltered, but he held his ground. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I'm starting to think I don't have a choice." From somewhere nearby, another engine rumbled to life. Another biker, waiting in the dark, watching. The boy and the man in the suit were outnumbered, but neither of them looked worried. That was the part that scared the leader the most. A moment passed. A long, tense moment where no one moved. Then, the leader nodded to his guys. The tall one with the scar reached into his jacket. Not a weapon, not yet, but it was enough to shift the energy completely. The boy's eyes flickered, his body subtly adjusting again. The man in the suit barely moved, but his expression changed, like he was bracing for what was coming next. The leader saw it, felt it, and for the first time in a long time, he wondered if he had made the wrong call. And then, another motorcycle rolled to life. But this one wasn't theirs. The bikers turned their heads just in time to see another figure emerge from the darkness, stepping off a sleek black bike. The person moved smoothly, almost silently, like they had been there the whole time, just waiting. The boy's expression didn't change, but the leader noticed something: recognition. Whoever this new person was, the boy knew them. And judging by the look in his eyes, that was the real problem. The leader suddenly had a feeling that whatever was happening here, whatever this kid was mixed up in, he had just stepped into something much bigger than a small-town diner and a kid who didn't flinch. And he wasn't sure he wanted to be part of it anymore. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. The leader of the bikers could tell this was no longer about him, no longer about his crew. Whatever he had stepped into was much bigger than he had realized. The new figure, the one who had arrived on the black motorcycle, took a slow step forward. The streetlights barely touched them, leaving their features in shadow. But even without seeing them clearly, the boy knew exactly who they were. He didn't move, didn't react, except for the way his hands curled slightly at his sides. The leader of the bikers noticed. The man in the suit exhaled, a quiet sound, but full of meaning. "This just got worse," he murmured. The figure stopped a few feet away, their voice cool and controlled. "You're not as careful as you think you are." The boy finally spoke, "And you're faster than I expected." The leader of the bikers looked between them, trying to piece it together. He wasn't sure who this new person was, but there was something about them, something that made the tension even sharper than before. The younger biker shifted uncomfortably. "Boss," he muttered under his breath, "I think we should get out of here." For the first time, the leader actually considered it. But before he could make a decision, the figure in the shadows turned their attention to him. "You don't belong in this," they said simply. That was the problem, wasn't it? He didn't. He had been so caught up in his own pride, his own need to prove something, that he hadn't realized he was playing a game he didn't understand. The boy took a slow step forward, forcing the leader's attention back to him. "You wanted answers," he said. "Now's your chance." The leader hesitated. This whole night had been about pushing, about figuring out who the kid was, what he was hiding. But now that he was standing at the edge of that truth, he wasn't sure he wanted it. The figure in the shadows took another step closer. "You're in the way," they said, voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a challenge. It was a fact. And that's what made it terrifying. The leader took a step back. It was instinct, pure survival. Whatever was happening here, whatever this boy was caught up in, he didn't want to be collateral damage. But just as he was about to signal to his crew to back off, something else happened. A noise. Not the rumble of an engine this time, not footsteps. Something else. From the end of the street, barely visible past the flickering streetlights, a sleek black car rolled to a stop. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The man in the suit tensed. The boy's shoulders straightened. Even a figure in the shadows shifted slightly, as if something had caught them off guard. Then the doors of the car slowly opened. And that's when the leader of the bikers realized this wasn't about him anymore. This was never about him. He and his crew had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now he wasn't sure if he'd be allowed to walk away at all.